At night, the human mind begins to change not because it suddenly becomes weaker, more anxious, or less capable, but because the world finally grows quiet enough for internal processes to surface, and when the constant stimulation of the day slowly fades away, the brain no longer needs to remain in a state of outward focus, productivity, and reaction, allowing attention to turn inward toward memory, emotion, and reflection, which is why thoughts that felt distant, manageable, or even irrelevant during the day often return with greater intensity once the lights are off and the body is still, as the mind transitions from a task-oriented mode into a reflective one, activating neural systems designed to review experiences, replay emotional moments, imagine future outcomes, and search for meaning, a process deeply rooted in human biology and evolution, because long before modern life, nighttime represented a period of relative safety where external threats were reduced and the brain could finally process the events of the day, evaluate risks, and prepare for what might come next. Yet in the modern world this natural rhythm has been disrupted, as most people no longer transition gently from activity into rest, but instead remain mentally stimulated until the very moment they expect sleep to arrive, consuming information, responding to messages, watching screens, and suppressing emotional reactions in order to remain functional, polite, and productive. Which means many thoughts and feelings are not processed when they arise but postponed, stored away as unfinished mental tasks that the brain does not forget, and when night finally arrives and external demands dissolve, these postponed thoughts return all at once, creating the sensation of overthinking, even though what is actually happening is delayed mental processing finally being allowed to occur. This inward shift is guided largely by the default mode network, a collection of interconnected brain regions that become more active when attention is not directed toward a specific external task, responsible for self-referential thinking, autobiographical memory, imagination, and emotional evaluation, which explains why nighttime thoughts so often revolve around personal identity, past conversations, unresolved interactions, perceived mistakes, and imagined futures, because the brain is attempting to integrate experiences into a coherent narrative, yet this process is made more difficult by fatigue, since a tired brain lacks the energy required for balanced emotional regulation, allowing negative interpretations to dominate, amplifying uncertainty, self-doubt, and worry, making neutral events feel significant and distant possibilities feel immediate and threatening, while darkness itself removes visual grounding cues, reducing sensory input and reinforcing internal focus, which further intensifies mental imagery and emotional responses, creating an environment where thoughts feel larger, more immersive, and harder to escape, not because they are more important than daytime thoughts, but because there is nothing competing for attention. This effect is especially strong in a culture that treats busyness as a virtue and silence as something to avoid, where moments of stillness are quickly filled with noise, teaching the mind to associate quiet with discomfort rather than safety, so when quiet finally arrives at night, it feels unfamiliar and even unsettling, allowing suppressed mental content to emerge abruptly and without structure, often without resolution, and the brain, wired to seek certainty and closure, attempts to regain a sense of control by analyzing, replaying, and predicting, believing that more thinking will lead to safety, even though this effort often results in circular patterns rather than clarity, and this cycle is reinforced by the nervous system, which may remain activated long after the day ends, particularly for those experiencing ongoing stress, because the body does not instantly recognize that it is safe to rest, maintaining a low level of vigilance that translates into mental activity rather than physical movement, causing thoughts to race even while the body lies still, and attempts to force sleep or suppress thinking often intensify the problem, because the brain interprets pressure as a signal that something is wrong, triggering stress responses that heighten alertness and delay relaxation, turning rest into something to be achieved rather than something to be allowed. At the same time, many people misinterpret nighttime overthinking as a personal flaw, assuming that calm or successful individuals do not experience it, when in reality it is often those who are thoughtful, conscientious, and emotionally aware who experience it most strongly, because their minds are actively engaged in responsibility, meaning-making, and anticipation, qualities that serve them well during the day but become overwhelming at night when energy is depleted, and this is further intensified by the brain's tendency to prioritize unresolved information, treating unfinished emotional experiences as more important than completed ones, which explains why the mind replays moments that lacked closure, conversations that felt ambiguous, or decisions that remain uncertain, because these represent open loops that the brain wants to close, even when no solution is available in the moment, and because modern life rarely provides enough space for reflection during waking hours, nighttime becomes the default container for emotional processing, turning the hours meant for rest into the only remaining space where thoughts can surface freely. yet this processing often occurs without guidance or balance, creating the impression of chaos rather than understanding. As exhaustion reduces the brain's ability to distinguish between realistic concerns and exaggerated fears, the imagination fills gaps with worst-case scenarios that feel convincing simply because the mind lacks the energy to challenge them, which is why worries that feel overwhelming at night often appear smaller or more manageable in the morning, not because the situation has changed, but because rest restores cognitive balance, perspective, and emotional regulation, revealing that many nighttime thoughts are reflections of fatigue rather than accurate assessments of reality. And understanding this reframes overthinking from an enemy to be eliminated into a natural mental state that requires gentleness rather than control, patience rather than urgency, allowing thoughts to be observed rather than resisted, creating the conditions for rest to arrive naturally, as sleep is not something the mind can be commanded into but something that emerges when conditions feel safe, familiar, and unpressured, and when nighttime thoughts arise, they can be viewed not as intruders but as signals from a mind that has been busy all day and finally has permission to speak, and when listened to calmly, without urgency or judgment, these thoughts gradually lose their intensity, fading into the background of awareness, reminding us that the mind overthinks at night not because it is broken or failing, but because it is human, responding exactly as it was designed to when the world grows quiet and attention turns inward, seeking understanding, coherence, and rest. And just as the night eventually gives way to morning, these thoughts too will pass, leaving behind a clearer, calmer mind when rest has been allowed to arrive on its own terms. There is also something deeply human about the way the mind seeks reassurance at night, because when activity slows and distractions fade, the protective layers we wear during the day begin to loosen, and the mind gently scans for signs that everything is still okay, revisiting memories not to punish us but to understand them, replaying scenarios not to trap us but to learn from them, even though this process can feel uncomfortable when it happens without structure or rest, and this is why nighttime thoughts often carry a quieter emotional honesty, revealing concerns we were too busy to acknowledge earlier, questions we postponed, or feelings we set aside to remain composed, and while these thoughts may feel intrusive, they are often invitations rather than threats, asking for patience, self-compassion, and understanding rather than immediate solutions, reminding us that the mind does not only exist to perform and solve problems, but also to reflect, integrate, and heal, and when this reflective process is allowed to unfold gently, without pressure to reach conclusions, it often becomes less intense, as the nervous system gradually recognizes that there is no immediate danger, allowing the body to soften and the mind to slow, creating space where rest can begin to take shape naturally rather than being forced into existence. Paragraph 7. In this way, nighttime overthinking can be understood not as an obstacle to rest, but as a transition between the outward demands of the day and the inward stillness of sleep, a brief moment where the mind releases what it has been carrying, sorting through fragments of experience before letting them go. And while this transition may feel restless at times, it is also temporary, shaped by fatigue, silence, and the brain's natural rhythms rather than by fixed truths or permanent states, and remembering this can soften the urgency of nighttime thoughts, allowing them to pass without resistance, as clouds drifting across a quiet sky, knowing that clarity does not arrive through effort in the dark, but through rest that arrives when the mind feels safe enough to stop searching, and just as the body trusts sleep to come on its own, the mind can be trusted to settle when it no longer feels rushed or judged, leaving behind a sense of calm that does not come from having every answer, but from understanding that it is okay to pause, to not solve everything tonight, and to allow the quiet hours to pass gently, knowing that morning will bring a different light, a steadier perspective, and a renewed ability to meet the world with clarity once rest has been allowed to do its work.